Okay. Share screen. All right. All right. So we're back to Ayin Beis here, and we're in Parshas Koirach, in the second parak in Parshas Koirach, which is Parak of Beis. Up until now, we've been talking for the whole Hemshech so far, essentially about the Inyan of the sefiros Agnuzois, which the sefiros Agnuzois are the Inyan of the Hagbola of the Oyer in the Oren Sof before the tzimtzum. The Rishimo is the Hagbola of the Kalim, and that only happens after the tzimtzum, but the sefiros Agnuzos are already in the Oyer, in the Oren Sof Lifnei tzimtzum. So we asked the question, and there all the sefiros of Bechinas Iskalulus and Behis Achtus. So we asked the question, how could it be that you have Iskalulus in His Achtus Sefiros, Agnuzois, if we already know that there's 10 sefiros Agnuzois? How could that be? So we explained that the Indian of Iskalulus in His Achtus of the sefiros is because they're nichlal in the Orient Sof, because that's their Indian, the Bebchinas Dveikus, in the etzem of and anything that's dovuk in the etzem is like the etzem, and therefore automatically it turns out that they're going to be his kalulus and his achtus. But nevertheless, there's 10 of them because the Ratzon HaKadosh Baruch Hu was that there should be oilmus mugbolim, and this is how the oiro is going to come down into kelim mugbolim, because otherwise it would be or bleak wool in a kli which is wool, and it wouldn't, the whole thing wouldn't work.
I wanted to ask here, so aren't we touching on this ultimate paradox that there is some finite thing inside the infinite, and it just because Hashem wanted to be like this. It's like the proverbial stone that he couldn't live, but he can create it anyway if he wants to. So he creates it like that, and I mean it's not a creation yet. And so then there was a morsel of the the stone, the flintstone.
Yeah.
So could we say that this is like they exist, but they only exist in potential? They
Right.
don't
There has to
really.
be There has to be a pa'ula for them to actually come out into his galus. That is correct. Yes, there has to be some kind of pa'ula, like the hitting, like striking the flintstone. Only then will they come out and be his galus. But in the meanwhile, they're not be his galus. That's correct. But don't forget that we're talking here about oil. Oil is not atzmus. And atzmus, without question, is bleak wool and so on. And the or is also bleak wool at this point in time. The or is bebechinas bleak wool. Only what? The or has a potential in it to come into tzir. In other words, in the or itself, there's a madrega in the or. Again, there's three madregas in the or. The or, the etzema or shebegilu la'atzmoy, and or hashayich lo'elemis, or hashayich la'gvul. So the or hashayich lo'elemis, or hashayich la'gvul, is the or that we're talking about where the sefiros Agnuzas exist. The sefiros Agnuzas in this or that shaykh to oilemis. And because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted mitzad the Inyan of Dira B'Tachtonim, he wanted oilemis, yet he wanted the or to be misgale in the oilemis. Therefore, there's an epis and Inyan of tziyur in the or. In other words, the potential for tziyur in the or later on, for hagbola and tziyur in the or later on. I hope that answers it. So let's go. We will start with Perik Chof Beis. V'hinei. Ba'ifan kazeh, k'mo she'hein ba'atzmusi yizborach, אי אפשר שימשכו באוילמס. It's impossible for them to come into the oilmus the way they are in atzmus. In other words, the way they are in the oil lifnei ha-tzimtzum. Why? He's going to explain. V'hu. The reason is as follows: it's not able to receive such an or parshut. After all, the oilam is mugbalim by definition. The Indian of oilam is loshen he'elem and loshen gvul. Otherwise, it wouldn't be an Indian of oilam. And therefore, in order for there to be a hizgalus in the Indian of oilam, bechinas he'elem and bechinas gvul, the or Parshat couldn't be Mizgala there, because if it would be Mizgala there, everything that it came into touch with, so to speak, would also be in a state of Pshitus. Therefore, the or as it is with Pshitus has to be has to go through the process of tzimtzum in order to come down into the kalim, even in the highest of oilemes, afilu in the oilemes, which are called oilemes ein sof, in other words, the oilemes of ak, and so on. Even for ak, there has to be this tzimtzum. Okay, so that's one reason. The oil cannot be miskabel in the oilemes if it's b'chinas pshitus. V'oid, another reason. Shima yu nimshachim ha'eses which is like nuzes k'mo shehem b'orei in sof, if they would be nimshach the way they are in the Or Sof before the tzimtzum shilfnei tzimtzum, hayu nimshachim kulam yachad, they would be drawn down, all of them together, and there wouldn't be nikar one from the other. So what would be the purpose of even having these inyan and the inyan of sefiros and the Or? Because there wouldn't be nikar as different koiches within the Or. And he gives an example of this. Komo koiches hane'elamim, as we find with the koiches hane'elamim in the nefesh, shenimshachim kulam b'yachad, that when a person has, for example, in a state of nevuah, or in the state of his galus of yichida shebenefesh, right? The koiches and ne'elamim are revealed, and they're revealed in such a way that kulam nimshachim yachad. It's not that it's the inyan of chokhmah or the inyan of bina or chesed or gevura. All of them are brought to bear together. And what happens in such a time? There's no inyan of seder and hadroga. That's why a novi, when he has this kind of his galus, it's called a mashuga, right? The novim are called mashugoim. Why? Because they don't go according to tam v'das, according to seichel, and so on and so forth. It's not his galus in the normal way of inyonim, in the normal seder ha'inyonim. There's no seder when there's his galus of the etzem. So he's going to explain this lagabe the eses features as well. Again, kamo kochas hane'elamim b'nefesh nimshachim kulam b'yachad chulu. Ki yadu, the kochas gluyim, not the koiches ha'atzmim, not the koiches hane'elamim, but the koiches ha'gluim. Oifen hamshochasam hu b'seder hadroga is in a state of seder. There's ishtalshelus. There's order. There's before. There's after. This one has to come first. That one has to come next, and so on and so forth. But kedima ve'ichur, there has to be prior and then afterwards, and so on and so forth. That's how the koiches hagluyim come into gilui. In other words, in koiches hagluyim, you don't have an inyan of a midrash belev before you have an inyan of seichel. First has to be seichel, and that gives rise to midrash belev. Then midrash belev gives rise to the inyan of nehi, of poel mamash pu'ula. Right, the inyan of nehi is the inyan of pu'ula essentially. So first it has to come from seichel to midos, and from midos to pu'ulos. In any event, that's how it works. Kedima v'yichur. This has to precede that. The tchila hu hamshochas hamoichin. First of all comes the moichin. V'achar kach nimshach hamshochas hamidos. Only afterwards the midos. The ef shal yos is galus hamidos blikadim is hamoichin. You can't have the midos before the moichin. It just doesn't work. In olam hatikun, in olam, in the inyonim of koiches hagluyim in the nefesh. Yes, it's true that when you have a person who's mi'olam hatoyu, you can have anything happen, but that's dafka olam hatoyu. Someone who's not operating on, he's not firing on all cylinders. Samela, things happen differently. But we're talking about in the normal world of a normal person. V'hainu, b'midrash al pitam b'das, the midas have to be al pitam b'das, and then when the al pitam b'das, then the midas can be misgale. Behind the midas al pitam b'das, she'er shal yosis, oris hamidus hamidos kiyim al the kedimis hasaga trila. First has to come hasaga, his boinonus in the inyan, and then it's moira the midas, because the midas have to be misoira al the moichin. That's just the teva ha'inyonim. Davka kasher nifsak gilo or hamoichin, and only when the or hamoichin comes to its end. In other words, when the or hamoichin has done its thinking, and now the midos have a chance to wake up, that's because the moichin have done their thinking. Now, it doesn't mean that the inyan is not buried in the back of his mind, but if someone is vertracht in an inyan, he's deeply absorbed in thinking through a certain issue, a certain problem, whatever it may happen to be, even in a davachol, let's say a person's thinking about some mathematical formula, whatever it is, very hard to speak to such a person, communicate with them, and see what's going on with them. They're vertracht in their minds, and they don't like they can't relate outside of themselves, and even within themselves, they can't relate to particular midos. When a person's involved in moichin, the midos are quiet. They're keeping, hopefully anyway, keeping quiet, and only when the moichin is nifsak, the person stops thinking about it in such a deep oifen, but he only has it in sort of as an image in his mind, at the back of his mind. Then the midos can start. As yet told us some midos. Then the midos can wake up and be born from the seichel, so to speak. The Beis is galas hamoichin because at the time when the moichin is gala, is galas hamidas. You can't have both at the same time. It doesn't work like that, right? Only when one is switched off, then the other one can switch on, and vice versa is also true. If the midos are switched on, the moichin don't operate. As we know with little kids, when they're having a temper tantrum or whatever it is, you can't talk seichel to them. A, because they're little kids, but B, the reason behind it is because the midas of the sefiros, the midas are working themselves up, and so on and so forth. They're behispilus, and therefore the seichel is not working. As we know, when a person gets also into a tremendous chaos, for example, right? You can't talk reason to such a person. You can't talk reason to him. Why? Because the midos are so powerful at that point in time that the seichel is not able to operate. So it works both ways. The midos, when the midos are behis galus, the seichel is quiet. When the seichel is behis galus, the midos are quiet. At least that's the way it's supposed to be. Ubehis galus hakoiches hane'elomim, but that's all talking about the koiches hagluyim. But when it comes to the koiches hane'elomim, the hidden koiches, in other words, the koiches and the etzem nefesh, ain't okay. That is not the case. The Beis is galus haramoichin, efshach liyos is galus hamidas. That when the moichin is awake, the midas can also be awake. In other words, all the koiches can wake up at the same time, and that's what happened with the novi. More Beis hasimcha. He doesn't say Beis hanavua here because l'chayra the Rebbe Rashab wants to bring it down to an experience that we can see by ourselves. Since most of us, we assume, are not Nevi'im, and if you are, I have a good psychiatrist. Uh, um, so in normal everyday experience, where do we see this kind of thing? Be'ez hasimcha, kamo be'ez hasimcha, shemizgalim koiches hane'elomim, einis galusim b'seder v'hadrog kedima v'yichor. At a time of tremendous simcha, at a time of, I remember from bringing sometimes by the Rebbe, when things would get into mamash a state of hispilus, all the koiches were going. You were listening to what the Rebbe was saying, and at the same time, it was a tremendous hisoirus amidus and so on and so forth. It was everything was happening at once. Why? Because l'chayra, that was the inner koiches and ne'elamim, at least to some degree. But how much more so at a time of a chasana, let's say, when a person's only child goes under the chuppah. It's a time of tremendous joy, and therefore the koiches and ne'elamim can be mizgalim ke'echad. There's no seder to the hisgalus. The Beis is galus hamoichin, yachol yois is galus hamidas. Or hamoichim mizgalim as beyoiser. You can have midas and moichin, the same thing, or both at the same time. And the moichin or mizgalim beyoiser, in other words, there's an overflow of moichin, so to speak. Tremendous awakening, tremendous arousal of simcha and so on. And as we actually see in our own experience, we see it with our own senses. Shebeis hasimcha. At the time of simcha, a person can come to understand in yonim that he couldn't understand at any other time. In yonim nalim b'yoser. V'kame in yonim shelo hayu misyashvim etzlo, and a number of yonim that weren't b'yisyashvus by him, they weren't, he couldn't grasp them fully. At a normal time when it was just the moichin were operating, but it wasn't his galus of koiches and ne'elomim, it was just the ordinary koiches hagluyim that were operating. Lo hayu misyashvim etzloi, they did like an Indian that wasn't misyashvim, we didn't grasp it fully at the time. At the time of simcha, it can happen that he will come to such a gilu. It's a simcha yavo aleim. And there are stories. I'm just trying to remember. a story, one of the Hasidim, that is exactly what happened. He understood at the time of Simcha, was on Purim, I think it was, that he understood a pshat in Likutei Torah that he didn't understand the rest of the time. I don't remember the whole story, so I don't want to say it. But anyway, that's a davar that's something that happens, and it happens at the time of his galus koichas and elomim. V'hainu, and why is that? Mizgala as primius v'atzmius or seichel, because the essence of seichel is mizgale, and therefore a person can understand something that otherwise he couldn't understand. Why couldn't he understand it? Because the seichel that he was using before was a seichel mugbal, and now the seichel is lefi erech bligvul. He can chap inyonim that he couldn't chap otherwise. Now, if a person was able to exist on this state of Gilui Koichas and Elomim all the time, that would be he would be one of the one of the great tzaddikim with his galus of his Koichas and Elomim revealing in Yonim to him all of the time, like the Baal Shem Tov, I believe, was on this madrega, that he could just simply look at a person and see like everything about him. Why? Because the Koichas and Elomim were his galus. מכל מקום, באייס ההיא ממש, יהיה גם כן נסגלוס המידויס. Even though the seichel is misgale, and the pnimi is the atzmis seichel is misgale, nevertheless, the midas can also be misgale, because we're talking about koiches and elomim. They too are in a tremendous arousal and a state of isgalus. And it's not a bilbul one to the other. It's not usually when there's midos, it's mebalbul seichel. And seichel and mebalbul midas. But when it comes to koiches and elomim, it's not that way. They can exist side by side. And the reason is, the reason is that the koiches and elomim don't go beside of hadroga. There's no hishtaushulus of inyonim in the koiches and elomim. There's no hishtaushulus ha-inyonim. What do we mean to say by that? It means that all of them are makabel from the etzem hanefesh. All of them are makabel from etzem. They're not one. It's not that bina is makabel from chokhmah and das is makabel from bina and the midas are makabel from das. No, it's not like that. All of them have their own channels to the etzem hanefesh, so to speak. The etzem hanefesh must be on all of them equally. Ein makablim zeh mizeh. Ki im kulam makablim nishachim etzem hanefesh. All of them are makabel and on nimshach, in other words, they come to his galus me'etzma nefesh, and not from one another. Well, Cain ein bahem seder v'adrog v'nishachim kulam ke'echad, and therefore there's no seder. There's no seder in the koiches ne'elomim. Everything is drawn together at once. It's all misgale at the same time. Moichin midas, etc. The way it can't be with koiches gluyim. So all of this is emotional to be able to understand the union of these galus sefiros gnuzos. So he goes and explains that now. Bedugma kazo is yuvan lamaila. So too we can understand lamaila. The sefiros gluyos, which is not the sefiros hane'elomim, the sefiros gnuzos, but the sefiros gluyos, which is like the koiches gluyim in the nefesh. Hamshochas hamu b'seidah v'hadroga. They come about in a way of seder. There's a seder. First there's the inyan of moichin, then there's the inyan of midos, then there's the inyan of maisa. Right, so that's the way it works. It's shtolshelus. And im shachim b'seder v'hadroga b'chinas kadima v'yichu, first one and then the other. And there's a seder to the way the things work. The tchila hu amshachus b'galas hamoichin. First the moichin is miskale. The hainu atzilus b'chinas chokhmah bina. The emanation of chokhmah and bina. First chokhmah, then bina. Umichub, and then from chokhmah and bina, netzal zeranpin. Then comes the midos, the midos zerampin, and then eventually malchus. But dafka la'ach is ma'et or, and this only happens after there's a tzimtzum in the or. La'ach is ma'et or the chokhmah ubina. No, I don't mean the tzimtzum arishon here. It's just the inyan of the tzimtzum of the midos of zerampin legabe chokhmah and bina. Chokhmah and bina are the av v'aim. Right, the Abba ve'ima. Masha Enkain Zo is the tolda. It's that an or shel tolda. The light that comes to Zeranpin is only a secondary. How do you call it? An or shel tolda. How do you say that? What's the word? It's a generated light. It's light that's generated from a higher source, Chokhmah and Bina. So it's a second degree oir, right? It's not a first degree oir, it's a reflection, more or less. But Dafka Lachshin is Maita or the Chokhmah Bina. Netzal B'china Zo. Only then can Zo come along, because Zo cannot accept, cannot take, at least in the state, the normal state of Zo, it cannot take his galus of Or in Chokhmah and Bina, particularly when Zo is in a state of katnus. When Zo comes to a state of gadlus, then things change a little bit, but we'll see that later on. And the reason for this kedima ve'ichor, with this seidi shtalshalus in the koichas hanefesh and in the sefiros, is because one receives from the other. In other words, that's the way it's set up. There has to be an order in the way that the big nimshach first comes this and then comes that. But in the essence, since the union of gnuzois, like the koichas lomim, in the nefesh, aval essence gnuzois v'nei lomim morein soif. They don't receive from one another. In other words, Bina of Esses Agnuzes does not receive from Chochmah, and Chochmah does not receive from Keser, and Chesed doesn't receive from Chochmah or from Bina. They all get their Amshocha directly from the source, not from one another. So therefore, if the sefiros, the sefiros are atzmim, the sefiros are ne'elomim, would be revealed, that would come into revelation, kamo shehain, as is, yehiz galus kulam ke'echa, they would come out all at once, right? Or everything would be misgal at the same time. V'kulam b'bchinas toikev ha'or v'ha'giloy, and all of them with tremendously powerful giloy, bo'evish lo yu klal b'bchinas or pnimi. They could not become an or pnimi. In other words, an or in a kli. They could not become an or in a kli because they would all be misgala at once, and it would be misgala b'bchinas toikev b'bchinas toikev. That's in fact, we'll see later on, that's in fact what happened to Olam HaToyu. In Olam HaToyu, a certain aspect of this inyan of the Esetziris Agnuzois was misgale, and the Kalim were not ready for such a thing. They couldn't, and therefore you had the Shvius HaKalim. We'll get to that later on, but this is just a heads up that this actually comes from this inyan over here that we just spoke about. So again, there will be bechinas toikev ha'or v'hagilu bo'ev shelo yuklal bechinas or pnimi. What's or pnimi? Bechinas islabshus or is bekalim, or in a kli, that's or pnimi, or makif, or that's not in a kli. V'gam lo haya az inin ishtaushlus, and you wouldn't have had the inin of ishtaushlus at all if they were all misgale ke'echad, all misgale ke'koiches ne'elomim, or ke'sefiros ne'elomim. You wouldn't have a ishtaushlus sefiros where one receives from the next one. Klal. They wouldn't have been derived one from another. They wouldn't have chained down one from another. They rather they all receive from Or Ein Sof equally. And therefore you couldn't have the inyan of even the inyan of iskalus. In other words, in the Esetziris Agnuzois, if they would have been nimshach kamo shehaim, they wouldn't have been bebechinas iskalulus. Why not? Because the inyan of iskalulus is when each sphere is makabel from the other spheroids, right? In other words, when Bina is makabel from Chochmah, and Chochmah is makabel from Bina, and when both of them are mashpia to Chesed, and Chesed has an inyan of Chochmah, and it has an inyan of Bina in it, just as Chochmah has an inyan of Chesed in it, and an inyan of Bina in it, and so on. Right, so that's the inyan of iskalulus. Kanoida, as we know, the iskalulus of sefiros zemezeh v'zeh imzeh. Zeh mizeh means that you have chesed of chokhmah, and you have chesed shebechesed of chokhmah, and you have gvura shebechesed of chokhmah, and so on and so forth. This is iskalulus zeh mizeh, right? Zeh mizeh, and you also have the inyan of zeh imzeh. In other words, that the inyan of chokhmah of chesed relates to sefiros HaChochmah. The inyan of bina of gvura, let's say, relates to the sphere of bina. In other words, that the inyan of bina in both of them is basically the same inyan, just in a different scale. So then, shaykh dafka shem bechinas akbola. That can happen only if there's akbola, only if the spheres of there's a tzimtzum before it comes down in this way. Shaykh dafka shem bechinas akbola because it's lapshus bekalim. Then you can have iskalu ze im ze v'ze mize. But when we are talking about the koichos which are basically bligvul, bilti mugbolim, and shaykin in iskalus. You're not shaykh iskalus because all of them receive equally from the shoirish, from the etzem, and none of them receive from one another. That's in a mimer in Tafresh Nun Dalad, I believe. That wasn't Hakadosh Baruch Hu's intention. לא היה כן כוונס המאציל אלן ברוך הוא, the כוונס המאציל הוא שיהיה בחינת אור פנימי. He wanted an oilam in which there would be an in of tachtoinim and a dir betachtoinim. That's an in of or pnimi. His lapshus oiros bekalim. Dafka, that's what he wanted. So therefore, if the oiros, the spheres would have been misgale, bebechinas etzem spheros, that's not what such a world couldn't have existed. The world of or pnimi or oiros bekalim could not have possibly have existed. So again, or pnimi, he wanted an or pnimi. His lapshus oiros bekalim dafka of yebechinas ishtaushlos v'iskalulus, and that there would be ishtaushlos and iskalulus. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been shaykh to have a world at all. And that's why there is a tzimtzum. Tzimtzum or ein sof. Baruch hu b'shorish ha'oros. There's a tzimtzum in the shorish ha'or. What's the shorish ha'oros? In other words, in the or hashayach la'olemis, the or hashayach l'gvul. But before the tzimtzum, that's where the tzimtzum takes place, in that or. In the shorish ha'oros, that'll later on be oros amalubashim b'keilim and so on. Liyos, so that tzimtzum was there, so that it would happen. There would be liyos nimshachim sefiros miyuchados. Sefiros would be nimshach individually and not all at once. Shelo yeh b'chinis arvus v'isachtus. There wouldn't be nimshach as there are in the makor, b'chinis arvus v'isachtus, as we explained. But there would be nimshach individually as individual sefiros. But nevertheless, there could be a possibility of hiskalalus. In other words, chokhmah shebebina, and bina shebechokma, and so on. And it's not like chokma as it was in Or Ein Sof. Nimshcha bechinas chokma beizgalus. Oh, I'm sorry. I made a mistake over here. This last thing I said wrong. So the chokhmah, the way it is, is ta'ayen nimshach, but it's nimshach not with all the other spheres together. It's nimshach b'fnei atzma. V'nimshach b'fnei atzma. Shalot yeh v'knisis arvus im spheros. It shouldn't be mixed in with all the other spheros. Why not? Because in that way, chokhmah can be recognized as chokhmah and can be recognized as an independent sphere. This is the inyan of chokhmah. In the spheres like gnuzois, you can't really say that this is the inyan of chokhmah, because chokhmah is mixed in with bina, is mixed in with kesed, mixed in with chesed, and so on and so forth. It's possible to differentiate the spheres in the spheres like gnuzois, even though they are spheres. But nevertheless, they can't be differentiated in the way they can be differentiated and recognized independently and individually after the tzimtzum. Or so later, after the tzimtzum, you could say that this is dafka or chokhmah. It's not that it becomes independently recognized in the sense that it's not the same inyan at all as it was in its shorish. It's the same inyan in its shorish, but now it's recognizable as such. Before, let's give the example of white light, right? White light, regular, ordinary, everyday light. In white light, you can't see the colors of the light. The only way you can see it up is you split it up through a prism, right? Then you can see blue light and red light and yellow light and so on and so forth. Whereas in the ordinary ore itself that's like the sefiros agnuzo. It's the ore itself is the white light that you don't see the mila of the red light and the yellow light and so on and so forth. Masha Enkain. In the Agnus, in the Makor, you don't see that. Only later on, when it's split up, when there's a tzimtzum of the or, there's a splitting up of the or into individual things, can you see the mila of the Indian of blue light or the mila Indian of red light and so on and so forth. Okay, so he oisa chokhma mamish. So the chokhma gluya is it's an Indian of chokhma mamish kmoshi b'mekoira, like it was in his makor. Only in his makor, it wasn't recognizable as such because in the light before the prism, so to speak. It's only when it's divided off from the other sefiros, v'nizgala mimkoira, and it becomes revealed from its makor. Only then is it recognizable as dafka, the Indian of chokhmah. Then it becomes recognizable. Okay, a recognizable individual Indian of chokhmah. Here we can say this is the Indian of chokhmah. This is what it's all about. So in the Eses like Nuzois, chokhmah didn't have that tchuna that you could divide it off from others and say this is the Indian of chokhmah and that's the Indian of bina. It wasn't able to be divided in that way because it was all like one light, so to speak, like the light before the prism, and therefore it wasn't nikar. The only way we know about chokhmah in the Eses Gnuzois is actually from the Eses Gluyos. That afterwards, when it's misgala later on, then we know what the inyan is of the oir in its makor. We can extrapolate upwards and be mafshit from its gashmias in order to understand the way it was in its makor. But in the makor itself, it's not visible as such. Okay. Now, what's the inyan with galus hakelim? We said before that there's a koach gvul in the Or Ein Sof. We said that there's two koachs in the Or Ein Sof. There's koach gvul and there's koach bli gvul, or koach helem and koach gilui. In the koach gilui, as we said before, there's different madregas. There's madrega of koach gilui k'moshu, in other words, etzema, or koach gilui k'moshu la'atzmoi. That's a gilui la'atzmoi, and koach gilui k'moshu yeh ba'olemis in the future, and like it'll be in the olemis. So the the his galus of the sefiros in the oir after the tzimtzum. In other words, his galus from the sefiros agnuzois is not the same as what happened with his galus hakelim from the reshimo. What happened with the koach hagvul? The koach hagvul was not nikar at all. It wasn't recognizable at all because it was flooded with the or habligvul. When that or habligvul was concealed, let's call it histalkus or when the or was nistalik, then the koach hagvul became nikar. But the koach hagvul, and this is a very important point that is brought and emphasized very much in the Rebbe Maharash's Maimorim in Yornasi Tafresh Mem Gimel. He's the first one that really speaks about this by Arichus. I mean, Alter Rebbe also does to a certain extent, but not to the same extent. But he emphasizes that the law naga b'hem tzimtzum. The tzimtzum did not harm, it did not touch, did not affect the letters of the oisis hareshimu. It didn't affect the oisis hareshimu at all. Lo naga b'hem tzimtzum. Very important point that he makes and emphasizes over and over again. And therefore, the tzimtzum, as it affected the koach hagvul, was very different from the way the tzimtzum affected the koach habligvul, or the koach laha'ir b'midu gvul, which is what we're talking about, the koach of the or that would be laha'ir oilamis. There, what that did is it made a mute in the or, and it made the or come into his galus in such a way that it was affected. There's a mute in the or. Masha Einkain in the Rishimo, there was the Stalkus or, but there was no mute in the union of the Oisis Rishimo. He'll explain this. He's going to explain a little bit more. The Yesh Loimar, Shlagabe Shoshan Koiram, the Shorosh Makor of the Kalim. That's the beginning of Kocha Gvul Kmo Shehu Lifnei HaTzimtzum. HaKalim Heim Ba'en HaRoch Lagamre. Then the Kalim were completely Ba'en HaRoch to the to the Or Ein Sof. Right, the Kocha Gvul before the Tzimtzum. I'm sorry, the Kocha Gvul before the Tzimtzum is Ba'en HaRoch to the Kocha Gvul after the Tzimtzum, to the Reshimo. It's Ba'en HaRoch because the inyan of the Kalim after the Reshimo, the oisis that are Miskale, all the Tzimtzum, in other words, the oisis of Reshimo that are Miskale afterwards, were not an inyan in Oyer. They were not an inyan in the Oyer, and therefore they were Ba'en HaRoch to the Or. Adarabba. It's true that the Or covered over completely the oisis of the Tzimtzum, and therefore they weren't Nikar at all. But the oisis themselves were Kocha Gvul, they weren't Kocha Gilui, they were Kocha Helem. And therefore, after the Tzimtzum, they Ba'en HaRoch to their Makor. Masha Enka in the Oyer, Afal that the Or is reduced, it's still Oyer after the Tzimtzum. In other words, the Or of the sefiros, not the Kalim, but the Or of the sefiros, is not Ba'en HaRoch to its Makor. Masha Enka and the Kalim are Ba'en HaRoch because they're not an Inyan of Oyer. Okay, hope that's clear. Again, יש למש לגבי שורשן מקורים, וכן נזכור הגבול, כמו שהוא לפני הצמצום, הכלים הם באין ארוך לגמרי, there are באין ארוך. אבל באוירויס, that's not the case. גם לאחר הצמצום, אינם באין ארוך לגבי שורשן מקורים. They are not באין ארוך. Why? Because they're in Inyan in oir. מה שאין כן, the kli is not an Inyan in oir. So what's the Inyan of the Tzimtzum then? The Inyan of Tzimtzum will actually, he's Galus Or. So the Tzimtzum, as far as the Or was concerned, that the Or should come into Giloi, and not just come into Giloi, but come into Giloi, but Bechinas Or Prati, Bifnei Atzmoi, each individual Or, the Or of Chochmah, the Or of Bina, and so on and so forth. Shalai Dezen, as Bechinas Metzius Nikeres. In this way, it becomes a recognizable mitzvah. You can say, you see what it is and say what it is. It's a state of mute, it's a state of reduction of the or and the gilui. Yes, it's a reduction, but it's still or. Mashenka the kalim. Veinen who the galus goyim mitzias adavar, that the galus of something is what causes the mitzias thereof. What does he mean? Even if it would be that they would be revealed all together, in other words, not the way it happened, but even if it would have been different, that they would have all been revealed together, they would have nevertheless been recognized as a metzius, not an individual metzius of chokhmah or of bina or of chesed or gvura, etc., but they would nevertheless have been recognized as a metzius. Why? Because since the or is nistalek, the or abligvul is nistalek, what you left was an or mugbal, and even though that or mugbal would not have been, we couldn't have seen it as individual oirois, if that would have been the case, that they would have been nimshach in such a way. Nevertheless, we would see that there are metzias. As we had also with the koiches ha'atzmin that we spoke about before, when the koiches ha'nefesh misgale from the etzam ha'nefesh, you can see that the person's in a state of hispilus of one sort or another. You can see that the person's living in an inspired sort of environment, in a state of nevuah, and that's obviously going to be different from the way it was before when you couldn't see the nevuah. But nevertheless, even if you can't recognize each sphere individually, it's still a metzius of nevuah. So too, if the spheres were nimshach in that way, if it would be that they would be revealed all together, they would be revealed as a metzius, but obviously they wouldn't be recognizable one from the other. שלא היה ומובן שלא היה בבחינת מציאוס כמו בהסגלוס מדרגס pratius. We wouldn't have been able to recognize the specific madregas of each sphere, chokhmah, bina, and so on. Well, היה בהם אז ריבו אור, but then they would have had a tremendous amount of or in them. But that's not the way it was. Each sphere was nimshach individually, right? There's the Esa spheres are gnuzois, Wurbe Bechinus is Kalus, and so on, but the tzimtzum calls that each sphere would be nimshach individually as a metzius and as a sphere bifna atzmoi. That chokhmah is chokhmah and bina is bina and chesed is chesed and so on and so forth, and it's recognizable as an independent and individual sphere. Independent is not the right word, individual. This is a reduction in the or, and later he's going to explain this in the next parak. As we know with the revelation of a ray of light from the sun, as it says in Tanya, in the second part of Tanya, the beguf kanor hashemesh who beyeta says beyeta oz because ribo haor beizgalus means beizgalus means ma'at haor. In other words, when the or was in a chayrish, when the ray was actually in the sun, it was a tremendous ribo of or, and when it comes out of the sun as one ray of light, it's reduced and is recognizable as an individual ray of light. But nevertheless, it still doesn't change the essence of the thing. The essence of the thing is still chokhmah, or the essence of the thing is still chesed. It is the same or as before, but it's reduced. Therefore, it turns out, the sefiros of chokhmah, the recognition of the sphere of Chokhmah, because it's divided from the other sefiros, they're recognized individually. It's not only in terms of the mahus of Chokhmah, that we can see Chokhmah as Chokhmah and not as mixed in with Bina, but also because there's a reduction of the Or. As we know, when the light goes through the prism, right? Not only is the light split up into individual um, um, lights that are mechulokim one from the other, red is red and blue is blue, and they come out in different parts of the prism, but the or is also reduced. The intensity of the or is reduced on the other side of the prism. And that's why it's possible for that or to later on be mislabish in the kli because of the tzimtzum, because it comes out as a sphere nikeres on its own, and because of the miyuta or. Now it's not a different inyan; it's the same inyan but on a smaller scale. Nevertheless, it's one of the mashalim that's used for this is the inyan of the marois. It's a medrash. Medrash says an interesting thing that if you look. If you look at yourself in a pond of water, so you'll see your face in the whole pond, right? You see your reflection in the pond. Obviously, we're talking about a still pond on a clear day and so on and so forth. You see your reflection in the pond. And if you take a drop of water, you can see your reflection in the water. Even if it's just a drop of water, you can still see your reflection in the water. It doesn't just take a reflection of your eye, it takes a reflection of all of you, right? Your whole visage is seen there. So the same thing with the esesuris like nuzois, which is like the reflection in the pond of water, and the esesuris like gluyois, which is the reflection in the drop of water. The drop of water is much reduced from the water where it is in the pond, but nevertheless, it's the same image that appears. Yes, slight distortion in the drop, but nevertheless, that's the way it is. Okay. Kitzer, if they would have been revealed without tzimtzum, they would have been revealed all at once. There wouldn't have been a proper order in which the sefiros would operate and would be seen. In other words, they would all be revealed at once, and there would be no one sphere received from the other. You have to have this one before that one. Moichin has to come before Midas, and so on. And not only that, not only would there not be hadroga, and seder, but there would be a riboy, or there would be so much of a riboy to the extent that v'lo hayu b'chinas or pnimi, they wouldn't have been able to be oires within kalim. V'lo haya inyan ishtaushlos, and you wouldn't have had ishtaushlos, you wouldn't have had or pnimi, you wouldn't have oires in kalim. Al kain hutzrach tzimtzum, and therefore the tzimtzum was necessary not only to create the kalim, but even for the sake of the oires. It was necessary to have a tzimtzum. Again, the reason for the tzimtzum in the kalim is to be megala the inyan of the kli. Masha Einkain, the Indian of the Tzimtzum in the Oiros is that the sefiros should be, the Oiros should be recognized individually and divided from one another, mechulokim, and to reduce the oil in them as well. Vinyanahu sheyeh hizgalu sefiros pratios. There would be individual sefiros, more sefiros achokman b'fnei atzma, etc. Like there's there nasav and dragon nikeres because mute or will be recognizable, and there'll be a reduction in the oil. Okay, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. You can switch on your mic if you want, if there's questions, whatever. Okay, apparently not. So we'll end it here, and I will post this probably sometime tonight. Okay,
Thank you.
All right, welcome.
Thank you.
Lala tov.
Good
Good
night.